It's the gap that's developing rapidly in many nations between those who are older and need support and those who are working. That model is getting completely flipped around, where it's becoming what we call an inverted world, where we've just got so many people to support, and that's going to affect everybody. Nobody wins in that situation. Women turning 30 without a child, at best, had only a 50% chance. And there's multiple contributing factors, but the one reason is that fewer people are becoming parents.
Are we talking about 20% of all women ending up not having children?
Unplanned childlessness is really the new epidemic that's affecting society.
Adult diapers outsell baby diapers.
The world's falling birth rate isn't on the list of major threats to life as we know it, but it soon will be. Taxes are destined to soar, pension systems will become unsustainable, while our healthcare systems won't be able to cope with the ratio of old people to take care of compared to the shrinking number of taxpayers. Businesses will struggle to find workers to hire, school closures will accelerate, while social care will continually be slashed.
And they say it's an economic time bomb.
I'm worried about the birth rate. Most people think we have like too many people on the planet, but actually this is an outdated view. I think that the biggest problem the world will face in 20 years is population collapse. Collapse. I want to emphasize this. The biggest issue in 20 years will be population collapse.
What is the birth gap and why is it important?
Birth gap is the term I coined for the difference between, frankly, the older people that we're going to have to support in decades ahead, compared to the shrinking number of younger working people that will be paying the taxes to support them. So it's the gap that's developing rapidly in many nations between those who are older and need support and those who are working. Well, why is it important? In the past, we've built our economies based on typically growing populations, where by definition, as you're growing, the base is getting wider. The number of people to support is relatively small. So you can support the one retired person for maybe the 7 workers. That model is getting completely flipped around, where it's becoming what we call an inverted world, where we've just got so many people to support, and that's going to affect everybody. Nobody wins in that situation. So it's not just about the old people themselves who are going to have challenging lives to probably struggle to have the retirement that they expected to have, but also those younger people who are going to be paying more and more and more just for basic services to be maintained.
Okay. It seems to me that the pattern that you've noticed is happening at the same time when a number of really big changes in the society is happening. And the fact that our families are way more scattered all over the areas that are increasingly, bigger and bigger from logistically speaking. What is actually causing the birth gap? Is it just the patterns in the way that we live our lives, or is there something more to it?
Well, I think, first of all, just to say that there is a very clear pattern. We don't need to speculate on whether this is something that, is random or, just to step back for a second, the common understanding up until, frankly, when I joined some dots and saw these common patterns, the common understanding was that in Japan, where I live, that the situation is due to work-life balance, the extraordinary hours people work. Similarly, in Korea, people in South Korea work similarly long hours. So people here still do blame long working hours. But in Italy and Spain, you're going to have people blame high youth unemployment. So each part of the world has local issues, local problems. In the UK right now, people are very much blaming the cost of housing. But actually, if you stand back and look at all of these places, you see the same trend starting at the exact same time. So, and this includes the UK too. I've just done some recent analysis. So you can go back to 1973, 74. You can look at Japan and Italy and the UK, and you can see a vast change in demographic terms overnight. I mean, literally like flicking a switch when birth rates started to fall. US was actually a little bit earlier. In 71, you saw the first increase, or rather decrease in birth rates. I was going to say increase because let me explain the pattern. The pattern is an increase in childlessness in those nations. So a 73, childlessness rocketed in Japan, went up a lot in the UK and Italy, 71 in the US. So what we're finding, you're talking about fragmenting families. I think you're talking about the distance, maybe the kind of lives we're living. All of those things may be contributing factors, but the simple outcome, despite complex factors, the simple outcome is fewer and fewer people are actually becoming parents. And when you fewer people becoming parents, it gets harder to maintain birth rates. And that's what it all boils down to. So we need to look at why it is that in our societies, people, many of whom wanted to have children, that's the vast majority of childless people now, why is it that our societies are structured in certain ways that people are missing out on that opportunity?
Okay, so the beginning of the birth gap, did you say that it all kind of started around 1970s-ish, give and take a couple of years depending on the country?
Yes, the first time we see it is around 1968 in Germany. And Germany during this time was going through a lot of turmoil, what we describe as the student riots, where there was deep issues within German society. And then we see it in 71 in the US. And at that time, we have what was called the Nixon shock, an economic situation to do with the gold standard, just changing of how economics worked. Then 73, we see the oil shock, which really transformed birth rates in much of Europe and Japan. In the 90s, we see it in Korea during what is known as the currency crisis there. And then most recently, we see it in multiple countries in 2008, 7, 8, 9, right after the mortgage crisis. So what we see is, and I'm not talking of an increase in childlessness of 1 or 2%. I'm talking, for example, in the case of Japan or Italy, of childlessness going from less than 5% up to 22, 25%, then up to 30% in a very few years' time. So it was a complete transformation of society and all linked to these crises. So why would that be? And it gets more interesting because what we see is childlessness is never recovering in any of these nations. There's no nation where childlessness was maintained at these higher levels and then settled back to its former state. So we're seeing a one-time transformation. And, so even when the oil shock kind of, what was long past, childlessness did not revert. So these were one-time transformations. And then, we look at data, which is wonderful because we got so much data from these eras that we can go back, not just to look at birth rates. We can look at the ages that people were having children. We can look at this in terms of geographies. We can compare rural and urban areas. And we see really what was happening here was a deferral of parenthood, delaying of parenthood, rather. And to me, what is really most convincing in this regard is that it was a delay, is that if you look at people who already had children, those who had one child, they were just as likely to go on to have a second child as before these shocks occurred. There was no change in motherhood, 2 to 3, 3 to 4. All those patterns really didn't change at all. The only thing that happened was those people who were most likely, given historic patterns, most likely to have children in their early 20s, maybe back in the 70s. We're deferring that to their late 20s into their 30s. And society really got, the fundamentals of, the common thing, what the norm changed to have children later in life. And when that happens, what's really clear, and I think, you see this in the documentary multiple times, the documentary I made, that you see these stories, you hear these emotional outbursts of people who delayed parenthood, didn't feel they were delaying parenthood because society tells us that it's normal to have children in their 30s, but time after time, people miss out. And that's often due to simple things like not having a partner or going through a divorce or breakup. It's not just the biological side of it. So these crises kind of encourage people to, encourage is not the right word. I think I can see naturally why many people would delay parenthood going through a crisis. I can see why the new norm would become, well, why not spend our 20s, doing other things? Society's, really adopted that very quickly, and the outcome has been that overall what we're seeing in developed nations and many developing nations, 1/3 or more of people really are now destined to be childless for life.
Mm. It's interesting going back to my upbringing. In a way, I was sort of growing up in Poland, which tends to be culturally 20 to 50 years behind the West, if you like. Right now, that gap is shrinking very rapidly as well. But at the time, I felt like the childhood that I had was probably 20, 30 years behind the UK at the time. And although my grandparents had large families and my parents or aunties had relatively large families, nobody ever told us, like, career is all great, but having family is also really important. That idea never even crossed my mind up until late 20s, early 30s. So when you said that the women or women, and it will be probably for women the time that the clock is starting to alert them to the fact that there is something not quite right within their lives. Is that what you're seeing? That women sort of tend to turn early 30s, for example, mid 30s, and they're like, okay, I've got all of these things. How about a baby? And then they start and it doesn't quite happen? Or is it just that they never actually find partners? Like in your documentary and in the research, because I know that you've talked to a lot of people, what were the patterns in terms of the ages, for example, that certain behaviors, for example, or certain transitions started to happen?
Yeah. So let me start with a statistic first of all. So this is from data. So from data across all of the countries I've mentioned, women turning 30 without a child at best had only a 50% chance of ever becoming a mother. So if you don't have a child by age 30, it's a toss of a coin whether you will ever become a mother. I think that's shocked really quite a lot of people. I know it has, because society really doesn't teach us that in the same way you in Poland. But I think in there are no countries where we actually, that I'm aware of at least, where we're teaching young people, men and women, that there is this thing called the biology clock, and that the clock is actually ticking probably faster in many cases than we expect. So that 50-50 statistic, more commonly, when I ask people would think that would be somewhere between 35 or more likely 40. So it's 5 to 10 years sooner than most people are thinking. And so that's the data. In terms of the stories you refer to, for the documentary, I interviewed over 230 people across 24 countries, but whilst making the documentary and in the years since, I've been, in the great position of people opening up to me about their lives. I think because people know the topic that I'm interested in, and it's rare to find an opportunity to talk about this, people do open up. So I feel I've got a wide spectrum of experiences to call upon. And the first thing I would say is there's no single magic age, but around 30 is probably about right. I've certainly seen some younger women, 27, 28, suddenly have an urge. That's a little bit more rare than 29, 30, 31. Typically, we do see a significant urge, and also after that. So it's somewhere between, I would say, 27, 28 up to 31, 32. And it can be quite dramatic. It can be quick. There was one woman who does appear in the documentary who had no interest in children at all until she was 32. And at age 32, she couldn't think about anything else. She had to have a child. So I think this is one point to just pause on here. When you look at statistics on things like the biology clock, we're talking of averages here. That the average age for the biology clock to start falling might be whatever it is. I'm not going to say a number because I might come to that in a moment. But the point is, it's not the same for everyone. For some people, it's younger. For some people, it's a bit older. So being told, "Oh, you're fine, you can wait until you're 35 before even thinking of a child," it's not that for everybody at all. It's certainly not 35 on average, even. But as a young person, man or woman, if you're planning to have a child, you cannot make the assumption that whatever the kind of that expected range applies to you. You might be unlucky, and there are tests that are offered today. I'm not sure of the efficacy of them, how good they are, but they speak to the point where you can do a blood test, a pinprick test, and women can send this off and have an analysis of the number of eggs, I think. Mm-hmm. And I know women have done that in their mid-20s and been quite shocked to be told that their number of eggs is actually dwindling faster than average. So we're not all the same, is my first core point here. But beyond that, I want to come back to there's two things to cover here. In terms of the biology side, and I interviewed 5 fertility doctors, and you see many of them in the documentary itself. They all said the same thing about there being 2 core points about the biological side. And that is the quantity of eggs that a woman produces every month, and the quality of those eggs. So the quantity is going down year by year. Women don't create new eggs. Women are born with all of the eggs that they will ever have throughout their life. So those are dwindling. Meanwhile, the quality of eggs decreases. That means the likelihood or ability of an egg to become a baby becomes less and less likely. So those two things are going against you really from sometime in your 20s. Mid-20s, early 20s, late 20s, at some point that is starting to go down quite significantly. But there's a third factor as well, which is the ability to carry a baby to full term. That gets more and more difficult too, quite significantly. Certainly from mid-30s onwards, the odds of being able to carry a pregnancy 9 months decrease. So that's the biology side. But my second core point, the one I want to always come back to is, but actually that's not the biggest issue here. The biggest issue is related to having a partner who wants to have a child with you at the same time as you. And we tend to overlook that. People use terminologies. You see surveys on, when women decide to have a child, it's like going down to a store. It's like, people think of it like getting a pet. I've decided to get a cat or a dog or whatever. Having a child isn't like that. You need a partner. There needs to be 2 of you in this. Right? That's the ideal for the vast majority of people. And, it doesn't get easier as we get into our 30s to find partners, to find a partner who can say, right, well, even though we've adopted this lifestyle without children, right now is the right moment for us both to do this. So it just gets less and less likely that this will ever happen.
Having babies is one of the things that the modernity hasn't quite managed to achieve the next day delivery quite just yet. And I think if I was giving advice to my 22-year-old self, I would probably say, if you are planning to have a kid by 30, you need to start actively planning by 25. And in my head, it's like, okay, well, let's say that you're not quite financially stable or financially where you want to be. You might need to quit a job, you might need to find a new job or a better job. You might get some extra qualification, then the partner. You might need to finish the relationship that you are in now to then find a new one. None of this takes days or even months. And from what you were saying, and certainly the stories that I've heard, like in the documentary, it was very much just over the course of a couple of weeks, it became something that the women were probably thinking at the back of their mind to the top priority in their lives. And like you said, finding a partner, especially in the current world where, that there are some battles of sexes going on and in general relationships are suffering, might not be as straightforward as it once was.
Yeah, if it ever was straightforward. Well, I think it was certainly, before my time, even I think my parents' time, where, there were less options, I guess, first of all. So you would maybe, live perhaps in a slightly more rural area oftentimes, and there weren't so many candidates to become your partner. And maybe, when your friend got married and you saw that the likely men or women that you would partner with start to reduce, maybe there was more natural forces to encourage it. So certainly today, dating is not easy. I certainly recognize that. Now, I think you're right, by the way, in terms of saying, well, if you plan to have a child by 30, you need to start planning from 25. I remember one young woman I met who had this all figured out, which is very rare, but she was 24 and she was in a long distance relationship. And I was a little bit cautious. I've been in long distance relationships myself, and it's not easy. Mm-hmm. And I thought to her, well, look, 24, just be careful, because at some point you've got to make a decision. One of you does. And her response was that she was going to give it one more year, and if it wasn't right for whatever reason for both of them at that point to become serious and live in the same country, that she was going to break up, because it would take her 2 more years realistically to find her next serious boyfriend. And if that didn't work out, she wanted at least the opportunity to have one more chance to meet someone, to have a child before she was 30, because she wants 3 children. And to have 3 children, she needed to have a child by 30 to have, the 3 by mid-30s. And that was a very rare way for a 24-year-old to be thinking, but she was absolutely right. I mean, that's a very realistic way to think of the problems that you might find finding that person and the time it might take. Not thinking about this in our 20s is part of the problem here, because, we see the result, high levels of childlessness.
It's a shame, I think, that we are not actually teaching that in sex education at schools. God knows what it is they're teaching them nowadays, but certainly the things that matter don't seem to be drilled into kids. I didn't know the fertility window until it was too late to realistically do much about it. So the interesting thing, and it's a cruel interesting thing as well, is that from what I've looked at, the actual prime fertility for women is between 18 and 25, I think 25 or 26, something like that. And then it starts to go down. After 30, it's it's basically just speeds up. The deterioration of your fertility just keeps going down.
Yeah.
I think the cruel thing is that instinct, the biological clock, it's almost ringing when it's already too late. Perhaps not to have one, perhaps not to have two, but quite probably to have a bigger family that some women maybe imagine having in their early 20s.
Yeah, and just to speculate, and this is purely speculation on my part, but I wonder this urge that this bell that kind of sounds around age 30 for women. I wonder whether actually that's because society has led us to believe in our 20s that we've still got time. So we're kind of suppressing, we're hiding that, thinking, well, I've still got time, I've still got time. And then there is this thing about turning 30. There still is in people's minds, because it's a new decade. And the realization of a new decade starting, and I still might not have the partner, or I might not yet be at the position I want to be in the career ladder. The realization, wait a minute, I need to figure this out, might be really what we're sensing. It might not be a biological urge that kicks in. It might be just the realization. Certainly, the reaction I've had from a number of people watching the documentary, men and women, but particularly women, it is an awareness of that desire sooner. Yeah, I put it this way: a few babies now have been born after people watching the documentary, which is very interesting. And I think the documentary can take credit only for just increasing awareness of what might happen. So, I think it's a consequence. Put it this way: I think you said something fascinating there, that you were not aware of this, that you were not told about this by your family at all, and you also said correctly that we're not taught about the fertility window. So, I think the assumption, therefore, from younger people, entirely naturally, is that society has got this right, that we're telling them to get educated. We say that a lot, so that must be the thing to do, because that's what people do, and rightly so. And then we tell people to get established in the career ladder. That's what older people say. That's what parents say. So here's society encouraging you to do that right thing. And we don't ever say anything about children. So that must mean that having children in their 30s must be fine, because otherwise parents would be telling us, hurry up and have a child. And they don't. Or there'd be information and there isn't any, so it must be fine to have a child in their 30s. Then the realization of, wait a minute, why didn't you tell me this, is kind of this point where we're now at.
Two things I think there. The parents are telling the children, but they're telling it to them when the kids are teenagers. And what happens when the kids are teenagers? Your parents aren't cool. They know nothing. You know it all. And I think that there is the shift in kids in terms of where they get the wisdom from. Initially, it's the parents and the family. But then we know how kids are affected by their social circles. And being different as a teenager is just social suicide. So I think that young people are relying way more on culture to help them out around structuring their lives. And right now, following what is in the mainstream culture is just a recipe for depression, misery, and fighting within your relationships forever. So I think there is part of that is actually playing the role. And, back then in the days, like before 60s, 70s, if you wanted to have sex, you were having kids early. That's just as simple as that. Because there was no birth control.
Yeah, though I think, I agree with everything you're saying. Just on that point, though, a lot of people blame birth control as a reason for birth rates going down, but it's really not that simple at all, because in Japan, the pill was not legalized, not available until 1990, which is 2 decades or more after other nations. So we actually see birth rates falling in Japan at the exact same time as Europe, despite the fact birth control was hormonal birth control was available in Europe, but not in Japan. So it's not quite that simple. But certainly, it's changed now that we're a lot more in control of our bodies. That therefore, accidental pregnancies are less common, and that plays into this. But I do want to say, let me say this first of all. I always like to say how much I support those people who decide not to have children. I think it's really important to societies. We recognize that some people, it's less than 10%. It's probably somewhere around 6, 7, 8% of people just never get the desire to have children. And I think there's a lack of understanding between those who do have the desire and those who don't, and the kind of language that gets used today. So everyone's got a role in society, whether it's with children or without, and I support both. But accepting that most of us do want children, I think we have this large group of people who are, the term is grieving for the children that they never had. And this was a strange term when I first came across it, but it's commonly used. And for anybody watching or listening to this who's in that category, I would encourage, there are many online groups for men and women who are in this situation, who come together to discuss what it's like, the challenges of life without children, and there are many. But back to your point about teenagers and society, and also you made an interesting point as well about children's parents not being cool, so that they're not the people to listen to. So I'm fortunate. I do have 3 children of my own, and certainly I get that. But I think one of the things that I'm now actively pursuing as part of Birthgap.org, the organization I've created after making the documentary, and the number one mission is for all high school children to be made fully aware of the fertility window. And why wouldn't we do that? And it's actually really quite an interesting question. Like, why haven't we done that already? And we're very good at telling people how not to get pregnant, how not to get someone pregnant, and we're not quite so well. We're not talking at all, really, about the realities of how hard it can be to get pregnant at that time that we want. So, but yeah, so it's not all down to parents. You're right. It starts, I think, with education. And if the documentary itself can play a little role in enabling this conversation, I'd be very pleased, because it's a conversation that we need to be having a lot more.
Yeah. And Mary Harrington, in her book Progress Against Feminism, she talked about motherhood being a mimetic need. So it seems to be that when you start seeing more people around you having kids, it's almost like it's starting to trigger a thought in you to, well, do I want one? And I think if we are then as well, like, living in a society where the culture, the broad culture isn't actually talking about it as a potential challenge. It's all about, having your own business and being sustainable, or, being green. It's the priorities that we seem to be having nowadays in culture are all about me, are all about self. It's not really about potentially sacrificing part of your life for a greater good in the future, which family for a lot of people is. So what do you think about that the parenthood is that it spreads like a virus through the society just because other people are having kids or not?
Yeah, and I'm not an expert in this area, but it makes a lot of sense to me. I do believe that seeing children or seeing, your friend group start to become parents plays a role here, and perhaps a very significant role. Certainly, the converse is true. I've had comments from, young women saying, we're on the career path. None of my friends have children. I don't know how to have a child. I don't know how to fit a child into my work lifestyle. So part of it might be biology. Part of it might be just the practical uncertainty of how will I ever, reconfigure my life, because I haven't seen any of my friend group do this yet. So I think that is right. So, and just to extend that a little bit, it used to be when we had bigger families, we'd have more brothers and sisters, certainly more cousins, would be living in communities where we'd be closer to people we maybe grew up with. And if it wasn't someone in our friend group, it might be a sibling who had a child, it might be a cousin who had a child. So I think there's things are going against us there. We're living in more isolated worlds, and we're tending to live, I think, with people who are going through similar periods of life together. So we might be moving to the city, we might be studying together, starting the career ladder together, and hanging out with people of similar ages to us. And we're kind of remote from other parts of community who are starting, that path towards parenthood. So, and that plays in other ways too. I think, the distance that we now have between, people who, I've moved country several times. People move cities, towns for careers, for other reasons now. And that means that we just don't have the support network around us, the parents and perhaps even the grandparents who would have been there to help out in some way, to raise a family. So we are left more on our own. So there's a lot of factors going against this here. But just to come back to data again, whilst all these are interesting points, we don't, people blame urbanization a lot for this, because you can map things back and you can say, oh, when urbanization started, that's when birth rates went down. But birth rates didn't go down evenly everywhere in parallel with urbanization happening at all. And if you look at these kind of oil shocks and crises that I mentioned earlier, you find that rural communities and urban communities were having fewer children. So it's not quite as simple a picture again as to say, oh, it's this one thing. So all these things are factors, but I want to come back to just putting the table again, if I can. There is one reason that this is happening, and there's multiple contributing factors, but the one reason is that fewer people are becoming parents. And just to emphasize a key point I probably skipped over a little bit, is that mothers today are having the same number of children as they did decades ago. So if you look at Japan, in Japan today, mothers are having 2.3 children on average. Now, I'm being very clear, just to be clear here, I'm saying mothers. So I'm looking at those people who do become a mother.
Not women.
Become a mother. 2.3. That's exactly the same as it was in 1970. It has not changed in 50 years. Now, in the US, it's 2.6 children today. And if you go back to the mid-80s, it was 2.4. So in the US, it's actually gone up a little bit in terms of family size. The UK, it's I forget my numbers for every single nation, so I'll not quote every nation, but it's somewhere around 2.4, I believe, in the UK, and that's exactly where it was going back to the 80s to indeed the 70s, I believe, for the UK. So mothers are not having fewer children at all, and that's quite remarkable to me. It tells me that once you have that first child, it doesn't matter what culture you're living in. It doesn't matter what the state of the economy is, if you're going through a crisis or not. It doesn't matter if there's other political changes going on, cultural changes going on. Mothers are resilient. Mothers are going on to have the same number of children, close to, I think, what their ideal family size would be. not for everyone, of course, but overall on average, it's remarkably resilient. The only thing that's changed in all of this is those people are not having children. So it's all about being in that position to have a child at that right time with that right partner. And then we need to look at why that, that is unraveled across all of these cultures and why that happened at the same time.
Yeah. Okay. I want to go back to something that you said earlier on. And it was about the fact that we haven't had one single nation that ever recovered from it. And it seems to be that we are stuck in a positive feedback loop, because once less women are having children, there will be less women in the second generation. And then it just keeps reinforcing itself. So what shocked me was the graphs in your documentary. 1.6 birth rate doesn't seem bad, does it? It's like it's only, less than 1 point below what we should be having. So it doesn't seem like it's going to make a difference. But that difference is seen in the graphs in the matter of 40, 50 years, which isn't that long. So do you want to just actually talk us through what does that 1.6, for example, because I think 1.6 is the UK's birth rate now.
Yes. Yeah. So no, you're right. This is kind of the stuff I love talking about. So just because it's not that, and not because it's data, it's because it's data that really is not well understood. And the reason is it's just very unfortunate that we've come up with the kind of systems that we have to try and explain birth rates. I really have a very strong disliking for this number, the fertility rate. I think this number is responsible actually for us really not understanding a lot of what's been happening around us. And one of the reasons is, as you hinted, it seems like one step to go from 1.7, say, to 1.6, another step 1.6 to 1.5. But these steps are not equal distance at all. Things accelerate rapidly. So if you look at take a curve, and this is actually a very stretched curve. It's very unusual, very stretched curve if you plot this out. And if you look at birth rates of around 2.0, very close to what we call replacement level, when people have 2 children to replace themselves into adulthood. It's 2.1 is the number somewhere close to 2.1, because unfortunately not everybody does make it into adulthood. Most do. But if you take a society with a birth rate of around 2.0, there aren't many these days, but if we take one of those, births would be halving in something like every 800 years. So it's a very small gap below the replacement level, and over many centuries, births would halve. Nothing to worry about. But you go down to 1.9, and that rapidly goes down to, I think it's 270 years. And then it goes down to 100 years, and then down to 60 years and 50 years. And if you get down to where South Korea is today at 0.8, births in South Korea are currently halving every 19 years. Now, that's frightening. Because societies cannot re-engineer themselves anywhere near quickly enough to cope with that shrinkage. And a reduction in children, why does that matter? Well, a few less schools, of course. But once those people become absent in the workforce, that's when you see societies really catastrophically crumbling. And communities, housing, crumbles because there aren't enough people to live in the towns to pay the taxes to maintain the roads. You get a really catastrophic end to societies. I mean, we really need to kind of see this for what it is. Now, let me just come back to South Korea and that example of halving every 19 years, and then we'll talk about the UK. If you are halving at that rate, it means that a person today who becomes a parent and then a grandparent and a great grandparent, if you take 100 of those people, 100 people today will result in only 4 or 5 great-grandchildren. We're going from 100 down to 4 or 5.
Wow.
And that's happening right now, today, in one of the most advanced countries anywhere. Now, in the UK, that halving is around, I believe it's around 60, 65 years. Now, compared to South Korea, that sounds wonderful. And it is, we do have a little bit more time, but this is still going to fundamentally tear at society. It's not sustainable at all. And we're going to see it, what it's going to mean in the UK. I'm originally from the UK too. We have the health service there, the free health service called the NHS. And, there are similar health services around the world, no matter how they're funded. They all require funding. And the funding comes one way or another from younger people working. That inevitably it has to. And as the number of people working goes down and down and down, the viability of those health services becomes, less and less possible. It becomes less and less possible to maintain the quality and the standards that we have. So for the UK, I do have some data from when I presented there not so long ago, that for people aged 75 and over, 60% of all NHS resources go to the over 75s. And I've heard similar numbers for other countries too. So it's older people naturally who are requiring the vast majority of healthcare services. And the number of older people is not going to go down anywhere near as fast as the number of workers going down. So, that ratio is really going to be felt in the UK. Arguably it's already being felt, just because year by year, taxes could go down, or the ability, and you can see already tensions happening where people become dissatisfied about quality of services. The roads are getting worse every year. Everything just feels negative. That's going to be life for decades until this situation is resolved.
What we're doing here, I think, is future cost stacking en masse, because we are stacking the costs onto future generations that currently perhaps governments don't want to face because they've got enough problems, and it might not be a sexy topic for them to get re-elected. And I'm just thinking, because obviously you mentioned NHS, pensions
Yes.
were created
Yes.
when we were living to, can't remember now, late 50s maybe, early 50s. So the pension system was actually created with the assumption that most people that were putting money into it would never draw from it. And now we've got it flipped, where almost everyone that put the money into the pot is draining that pot. But then the amount of people draining the pot is going up. The amount of people making the money to fill the pot will be going down.
Yeah.
And the services are going to suffer. Then you've got the property prices. They will be going down. And the interesting test subject, I suppose, was one of the cities in States. Which one? It wasn't Chicago. It was not Detroit. Where was the city where one of the main industries just collapsed?
And I think you are talking about Detroit.
Oh, is it Detroit?
I actually spent 6 or 7 years in Detroit. So that's where the automotive industry moved out of the city, and the population went down by 60%. Different reasons, nothing to do with birth rate, but the same underlying factors. You're right. And
what did life in Detroit look like then?
Yeah, so you had a very contrasting situation. You had the suburbs of Detroit, which were really isolated from this, because people effectively who were able to moved away from the city, because the city was just somewhere. It was like a war zone, and it's I say that, and I think people who experienced it would probably agree with me. If you look at the photographs, so street after street with houses that were just crumbling. So what happens, and this will happen everywhere, because when you have shrinking populations, that means you have excess housing. Doesn't, it's not like everybody on the east side of the city kind of, fades away first, and you still got a buzzing west side of the city and the north side, etc. No, it's fragmented parts of the city. If you take a street, it'll be one apartment is empty and a buyer can't be found, and then another house across the street, and then another one, and another one, and another one. And then you'll get buildings where half of the apartments are vacant and not maintained. And then you'll find that, well, the taxes to maintain that street aren't being paid, so the city can't afford to kind of repair the streets. In the case of Detroit, when I was there more than 10 years ago, there was this campaign to try and count the number of streetlights that were not working. Count, not fix them. The city simply did not know the situation about how many streetlights were working and not. And one of the problems in counting streetlights was that you had to go to streets at nighttime. And these were streets that were incredibly dangerous to go to. There was crime in these streets. There was horrendous crime going on. So people didn't want to go out. Workers didn't want to go out at nighttime to figure out, are the lights working or not? So the city didn't even know which lights were working and which ones weren't. So these are problems that start to unfold. That really, I think people have imagined that cities are going to just naturally shrink in some way. That I do get comments that brings a smile to my face, because it's natural to think that there are positives to this. It's like, oh, it's going to be so much easier to get a parking spot, or I'm not going to have to line up, whatever. Like, no, it doesn't work that way. Stores will close, coffee shops will close, parking spots won't be maintained. It's going to be just as difficult as ever we'll still compress ourselves into parts of cities that that are safe, that are growing, whilst other parts of the cities fall away. So there will be, to just broaden it a little bit, there will be what I'm describing as magnet cities, magnet towns, or magnet suburbs. The few suburbs that people still do gravitate towards, and it will be younger people gravitate towards these. So there will be some cool spot where still there are new things happening. There's new stores opening. There's still things to do at nighttime. It feels safe there, but those will be relatively expensive areas. So older retired people won't be able to move there quite as easily. They'll be left in the decaying areas. Not all young people will be able to afford these cooler areas, but those areas in time as well will start to fragment, because as population keeps going down again, as you said, this is kind of like a spiral that keeps going on and on and on. If you are a city and you've got 5 or 10 cool suburbs, 10 years from now, that number's always going to go down and down and down and down. That's the difference to Detroit and all of this. Detroit solved its problem because in time the population stabilized. So it went through several decades of shrinkage, and then it flattened out, and it then was able to work a way out of its troubles. And it's doing this, become a very cool city. It's great to see. And what they're now able to do is return many of those streets to parkland. They're introducing waterways that where streets used to be, but you can't do that in areas where there's continual, never-ending population decline, or at least it's not as easy. And that's what we're talking about here, because until birth rates go back up to that 2.1 number, until that point, this will never end. And as you say, nations have never been known to come out of this other than if it's through it. People say, well, what happened just after the war? They bounced back up, or after the Wall Street crash, they bounced back up. There are moments of time, short blips of time, where societies hadn't re-engineered themselves. The difference today is societies have re-engineered themselves for us to think more of having children in their 30s, and a third of us are ending up childless. Until we solve that problem, this will never end. So
this is actually something that I wanted to go back to, just to, again, put the data into perspective, because I think the statistics are difficult to picture unless you are experienced in statistics. So You said that 50% of women who don't have any kids by the time of 30 will not have any kids. And currently in the West, more than 50% of childless women are more than 50% of women go into their 30s without having a child. So we are talking about 25% of women who, for one reason or the other, will end up childless. And we talked about probably about 5% of the total population that don't want to have kids. Are we talking about 20% of all women ending up not having children?
It's actually more than that, but your math is actually very good, and you're the first person who's kind of put those two things together. So if I could just walk back a little bit,
go on, let's reverse it.
I know you're right, but I just want to qualify a couple of things here. One is that this number 50% is being used for two different important things, and because it's the same number, I think I've seen people kind of mix them up, and you haven't, so that's great. So there's two things. One is that today, less than half of people are having kids before they're 30. So, if you look at who has had a child by 30, it's less than half. What I'm also saying is that whatever that percentage is, even if 80% of people are having kids before they're 30, or even if it were 10%, whatever the percentage is, if you get to age 30, of those who do not have children, it's only half. And that's how you got your 25%. It's half of a half. So, and the reason I'm saying it's higher than that is, my exact number is that at best it's 50% chance that you'll have a child if you've no child by 30. It's actually around 28 or 29 where you actually hit that 50-50. So it's a bit more than that. And there's a bit more than 50% of people not becoming parents. So you put that all together, and it's a third is where you end up at today. It's a third of women in many countries, and actually there's specific cases where it's even later than that now. In Japan and Italy, it's more like 37-38% of people. It's heading towards 40%. And the US has actually really seen a huge shift. We're going through this wave right now of what I call societal childlessness in the US. And that means that the indicators are showing that because so few people are becoming mothers, that the likelihood of high levels of childlessness are really becoming embedded in society. Now, given that the mortgage crisis that really saw birth rates fall was 07, 08, you still have quite a few people, mid-30s, late 30s in the US hoping to become mothers, actually a very large number. So we're not really counting them as childless yet. But if this continues at the rates, and I'm pretty certain it will from other examples, you're going to see the US with the childless rates of 35% or higher as well. So it's 30%, but directionally it's going even higher again. And and with those who, I like your number, 5% do not wish to become parents. I've seen it creep up, to more like 7-8%. But it means that we're heading to situations where 4 times more people who are childless had wanted children than those who did not. And and this is an unknown today, because people who don't have children don't typically go out in the streets, telling us, I wanted to become a parent. It's a very private, it's a very secretive thing. It's a very personal thing, and it's a very painful thing for many. So this hasn't been talked about for good reason. There's it's such an intensely private thing, but it's very clear from the numbers, and it's very clear from quality surveys, large scale surveys and academic academic studies that try to unravel this as to what's been going on. And so the term I use, I don't think I've said it here, but I want to. The term I use is unplanned childlessness. People who had expected that at some moment in time they'd meet that right person and they would become a parent, and they get to age late 30s, 40, 45, and realize it didn't happen. So, so unplanned childlessness is really the new epidemic that's affecting society, and it is really the cause of, given that mothers are having the same number of children as decades ago, the entire crisis we're facing right now is attributed purely to unplanned childlessness.
And I think we are living way, way longer lives as well to prolong the regret potentially that people are going to have unless they are lucky or they get their lives together. And in the documentary, the part about you going to Japan is heart-wrenching, seeing the lives of the old people.
Well, I just want to say on that point, loneliness is, for me, the biggest crisis that this all leads to. And loneliness is a terrible thing. It's something that I think we don't quite emphasize enough in terms of the impact that loneliness can have on mental health, on physical health. And you're right, in Japan, but there's a part you may remember where I also go to Germany, and I get some stories from people as well as to people who live out their lives in care homes and what their latter years are like without family to support them. And I think for a younger person who may be saying that, well, if I don't have kids, maybe it doesn't matter so much because I've still got my friends. It really doesn't work out like that very often, or you can't assume it'll work out like that. Friendships may last decades, but may not, and people pass on sooner than others. People in friend groups do have children and take a different life path, but it's also the case that getting up and playing golf in your 80s may sound like a great dream, but reality is that if you do that once a week would be very fortunate, I think. Once a month or not at all. And the communities that you mentioned, you go there, and this is Tokyo. It's not that I did go to rural communities, and you saw that too, but you go to close to where I am right now, in Tokyo, and you see communities where there's no restaurants, there's no bars, there's a pharmacy, and that was the one thing you saw again, this community where the only store left open is a pharmacy. So that tells you, well, these people are not meeting up to go and play bingo or pachinko, it would be here, I guess. No, these are people spending most of their lives in their homes on their sofas, and probably the quality of life is much lower than I think we would hope for our own future lives.
So how did you get into even looking into the data? What happened in your life that made you interested in the subject?
Well, I first have to say I would never expect to make a film about any topic. At best, I was hoping to write a book about something. I felt I had a book in me. At some point, my background is in data analytics, data science. For 20 years or more, I've run a data science company where we look at large volumes of data, and we come up with interesting findings, usually to do with predicting the future. And I'm very lucky I've been able to work in some pretty leading edge data science techniques over the last 20 years or so. Is the time when what we call big data became a thing, that we had vast volumes of data that we could actually extract all these trends from. And I got to work with a number of great professors and had some great PhDs working in my team to do this. And throughout all of this time, never once did we ever think about falling birth rates. And, I realized, well, wait a minute, if anybody should know about the impact of falling birth rates, it should be someone involved in doing future forecasting. And the reason I hadn't been thinking about falling birth rates, nor anyone working alongside me, was that none of our clients were asking us to think about birth rates. And the clients were some of the largest corporations in the world who I would expect to be concerned at the shrinking number of future customers. Car companies were a large part of what we did to helping them with pricing, production, volume planning, and not once did any executive there, mention this. Now, when I saw data for Germany in particular, I knew about Japan a little bit because I think that's somewhat common knowledge that Japan has had a low birth rate. Maybe I knew it as well. I think about Italy. I didn't know Germany. Germany's an economic powerhouse, certainly in the auto industry. When I saw the birth rates for Germany were as low as, almost as low as Japan, and had been at that state since the 70s, it was just like shock. It was just like a spark. It was instantaneous. It's like, if I don't know this, and my clients don't know this, and if they knew it, they'd be talking about it. That means that no one really understands the impact of this. And in a heartbeat, it was a case of fewer customers, fewer workers, pension systems, too much housing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then the more I thought about it, everything got worse. It was, over a series of a few weeks, I was literally waking up in a sweat thinking, no, this can't be right. And as a parent of 3 teenagers at that moment in time, I felt an intense sense of failure. Because you try and prepare your children for the future. That's what being a parent's all about, really, I think, in terms of, not just what to do and what not to do and good and bad, but also about, education. And realizing that the entire world is going to be a very different world to the one that I was preparing them for, really, give me a sense of responsibility to them and their peers. And that's when I decided, to research this. I was really stunned that no demographer had come up with a common explanation to explain why this had happened in Japan and Germany and Italy at the exact same time. It was all local issues. No one had found any connection. And to me, that was just impossible. The chances of there being no connection at all was near zero. And I decided to put my time and effort into researching that and writing a book. And the story is that my younger son said, "Dad, young people never read books these days. We just watch documentaries." At which point I decided to effectively give up, knowing that there's no way I would ever make a documentary. But then I met someone who was in that world, Elise Cosgrove, and she was happy to take on the project. And I thought it would be a few weeks filming in Europe and Japan and would be done in a year. She told me no way, it would take 2 years, which I didn't believe, but it ended up taking 7 years. We filmed for 4 years. Not full time, but over the course of 4 years, we filmed in 24 countries. And while filming, I was looking at data and hearing people's stories. And that's when I realized, wait a minute, there's something to do with childlessness here. Mm-hmm. That's a common story in all of these countries. And that's when I looked at the data on family size and saw that the structure hadn't changed at all. And that's when I kind of worked out how to isolate the data down to what happened around these financial shocks. And that's when it was like so obvious that this is delayed parenthood and it's linked to financial crises just changing societal norms. And all these years later, here I am. So it took, actually it's 8 years now since first seeing that data.
The documentary is brilliant, so we've got your son to thank him for that it's even here. Let's talk solutions. What are the solutions to the opening birth gap?
This is where
let's finish on a high.
And there is reason for some optimism, but I don't want to go overboard here. It's because we're looking at a really gloomy situation. Tragically gloomy situation for individual lives, but for communities, for nations, for civilizations. I mean, this is civilization ending. And we've got to take it seriously. It only gets harder to solve now. Throughout the entire time making the documentary, there was no optimism on my part. There was no solution. If you look at schemes like, giving parents more time off or helping work-life balance in those countries where you still have to work till 8, 9, 10 p.m. like Japan or Korea, you look at solving those things and you can always find counterexamples. So I actually I had this today in a conversation in Tokyo, where there was a focus on a survey to find out how work-life balance can be improved to improve the birth rate. And I just told them this is not the solution. I got a really serious question put back to me. Well, why could that possibly be? I mean, work-life balance is what we need to solve. And I talked of Denmark as the counterexample, because in Denmark you get free education. Parents get 1 year paid leave off, parental, maternity, paternity leave shared between the two. It can be 6 months each. It can be 3 months for one, 9 months for the other. And yet the birth rate is almost as low as Japan. So there's no optimism to be found in specific individual policies. There are a couple of interesting things going on with countries like Hungary, who have put a vast amount of policies in place that may well have done something to increase the birth rate a bit, but it's still stuck around 1.6 there at the moment. So why am I optimistic at all? The optimism has come from those younger people who've watched the documentary and the reaction to it, which has been very intense, frankly. There's been a lot of shock from younger people, a lot of, and I do mean a lot of younger women in particular, really affected by the reality they might not become a mother in their 30s when they assumed that would be an easy thing to happen. And I can see in people's minds, younger people's minds, that potentially for those who really do want to become a parent, a kind of reworking of, I used to call it priorities. I think that's the wrong word now. I think it's just the scheduling, between establishing career, education, and becoming a parent. And that's going to be really hard because society really doesn't help at all. And it's going to have to change to support those younger people, younger women who do want to have parents sooner. That's critical here. But my fear was that, well, if people really don't care about this issue, if it doesn't really matter to enough people whether they become parents, really there would be no hope. And I mean no hope for the future of civilization. But that's not the case. There's intense desire to become a parent from the vast majority of young people. And given that there's fewer and fewer young people, in a sense, they now have the power to say to employers and educators, look, this is the life we want. And I think we've got to make it much more easy and bring less vulnerability, particularly to becoming a mother at a younger age. So there's a lot of work to do, but at least we have a desire, and at least there is a form of concern at the reality as to the world that we're living in, where 1/3 or more childlessness is now the norm. So younger people are the future, and that's where I get my optimism.
Stephen, I love your work. It's so important nowadays that people are aware of the issue and share it. Share it with people that are either holding off or waiting to perhaps for a good time to become a parent. And it's never a good time to become a parent. And for people that want to follow your work and watch the documentary, where should they go? Where can they stalk you online?
Well, first of all, thank you for the conversation, Kat. I really appreciate it. I've enjoyed it. I run a website called birthgap.org. We've got around 4,000 members where you can find all sorts of information. All the maps that are in the documentary are available there, and you can watch part 1 there too. YouTube also, you can watch part 1 on YouTube. You can find me on Twitter, or X as it now is, at Stephen J. Shaw. And if you want to message me directly on the birthgap.org website, there's a messaging system, and I do try and respond to anybody directly who wants to reach out to me on that website.
Stephen Shaw, thank you very much.
Thank you, Kat.
Thank you for tuning in to Wisdom Rebellion. Before you go, if you enjoyed the conversation, please consider subscribing. It massively helps with keeping the show on the road so we can all build a wiser world together. And if you loved this video, you will also love this one. I'll see you there.